Good evening. I'm Haley Ficuciello. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are again. Just when you think the Biden era was finally drifted into history books, another interview came along and reminded America that some stories simply refuse to go away. Last Sunday, former First Lady Jill Biden appeared on CBS Sunday Morning. The purpose seemed obvious: promote a new book, defend the Biden legacy, reassure the public. Maybe even put a neat little bow on one of the most controversial chapters in modern American politics. Instead, the interview managed to accomplish the exact opposite because every answer seemed to raise another question, and every explanation seemed to make Americans remember exactly why they started asking questions in the first place. Let's be honest, this isn't about Republicans. This isn't about Democrats. This isn't about policy. This is about credibility. And credibility is something that, once lost, is very difficult to recover. Let's go back to that debate. You remember it. America remembers it. The world remembers it. Millions of Americans sat in their living room and watched what would become one of the most consequential presidential debates in modern history. The reaction was immediate. Not days later, not weeks later, immediate. People were stunned. Political analysis were stunned. Journalists were stunned. Even members of President Biden's own party appeared stunned. The debate fundamentally changed the trajectory of the 2024 election. This isn't an opinion, that's history. Yet now we're being told that Jill Biden supposedly believed her husband had been experiencing a serious medical issue during the debate. Let's stop here for a moment. If your spouse is standing on stage before tens of millions of viewers and you genuinely believe that they may be suffering a medical emergency, what do? You rush to help them. You call a doctor. You demand evaluation. You stop everything because that's what normal people would do when they believe a loved one is having a medical crisis. But that's not what Americans witnessed. What Americans witnessed afterwards was reassurance. What Americans witnessed was confidence. What America witnessed was a campaign attempting to convince voters that everything was perfectly fine. And that's where the contradiction begins, because after the debate, the message wasn't, we're concerned. The message wasn't, we need answers. The message wasn't, we're evaluating the situation. No, the public message was that everything was under control. Everything was fine. Nothing unusual had occurred. Now, years later, we're hearing a very different story, and Americans are left wondering, which version are we supposed to believe? The version from the night that it happened, or the version that is being presented today? Because both cannot be true at the same time. And that brings us to the bigger issue, transparency. Because perhaps the most remarkable claims being made today is that there wasn't some broader pattern that people around President Biden wasn't recognizing. Really? Nobody noticed? Nobody saw anything. Nobody had concerns. Nobody observed anything unusual. Not advisors, not political strategists, not senior staff, not long-term friends, not family members. Nobody? That's a difficult argument to make, not because Americans are political experts, not because Americans are medical experts, but because Americans watched, because they observed, they listened, they formed their own conclusion. And many of those conclusions existed long before the debate stage ever came into view. Then there was the media component, and this is where things became especially uncomfortable. For years, concerns regarding President Biden's age and condition generated fierce debate. Critics raised questions, supporters dismissed those questions, journalists argued about those questions, the country argued those questions. Then came the debate. And suddenly, many people who had dismissed those concerns found themselves discussing those concerns almost overnight. The debate didn't create the issue. The debate made the issue impossible to ignore. There's a difference, a very important difference. Now let's talk about Washington's favorite disappearing act, accountability, because one thing remains remarkably consistent in American politics. When things go well, everyone wants credit. When things go badly, nobody seems to know what happened. It's almost impressive. Everybody was there, yet nobody knew. Everybody participated, yet nobody bears responsibility. Everybody reassured the public, yet somehow nobody misled the public. It's a political miracle, the kind that only seems impossible inside Beltway. And ultimately, that is why the story continues to resonate. Not because one interview, not because one debate, not because one book. This story persists because it touches something much larger: trust, public trust, institutional trust, trust in leadership, trust that elected officials, those closest to them, are being candid with American people. Once the trust begins to erode, every statement receives greater scrutiny, every explanation receives greater skepticism, and every interview generates new questions. That's exactly what happened last Sunday. What was intended to close a chapter appears to have reopened it, because every explanation offered seems to produce another contradiction, every clarification seems to generate another question, and every attempt to settle the debate reminds Americans why the debate started in the first place. At the end of the day, Americans can reach their own conclusions. They don't need politicians to tell them what they saw. They don't need consultants to explain what they remember, and they certainly don't need history rewritten for them after the fact. The cameras were rolling, the debate happened, the reaction happened, the controversy happened, and years later, the question remains. For Englebrook Independent News, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for watching. Good night.